LTA cleft actually is a very big topic, so I'll try to cover it as much as possible in the sense that I tell the salient points. It is very, very rare, 0.5 to 1.5%, but now they are telling the incidence may be more, 6 to 7%. But again, it may be due to the referral pattern also, but some statistical studies show that the incidence is more than just 0.5 to 1.5%. Commonest airway anomaly is laryngomalacia. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So it is defined as a craniocaudal slit of the, it's called as the party wall between the larynx and the pharynx. A party wall is a common wall like you see in apartments now, two apartments sharing a common wall. So it is like that between the larynx and the pharynx, and by extension between the cervicothoracic trachea and the esophagus. It is supposed to be more common in boys, 5:3 is the incidence. 50% will have syndromic and non-syndromic association. There are 4 syndromes which are associated with this. The Opitz-Fries syndrome, G syndrome, Pallister-Hall syndrome, Vactal, and charge association. Classification is into 4 types based on the extent of the lesion: type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4. Type 1 is supraglottic, above the level of the cords. Type 2 is cricoid cleft, which extends beyond the cords. Type 3 is cleft extending into the cervical extrathoracic trachea. Type 4 is into the intrathoracic trachea, occasionally into one of the mainstem bronchus. Some people have divided into 3A and 3B. Okay. Treatment is, diagnosis is basically based on the symptomatology of a combination of feeding and respiratory difficulties. It is often mistaken for laryngomalacia, disordered pharyngolaryngeal coordination, and severe GRD. Some CNS disorders also, it is confused for. One thing you must remember, when you diagnose a cleft, always do a complete bronchoscopy to look for a tracheoesophageal fistula, and also look for esophageal atresia. Don't miss that. Treatment is mainly endoscopic for type 1, 2, and 3, and open for type 3 and type 4, some of them. Okay. Diagnosis is by rigid endoscopy. Important thing is it is rigid endoscopy, so that you can palpate the party wall, the common wall, and because of the exuberant mucosa, it can get hidden. So you have to press and make it apparent, the cleft. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Presentation, type 1 usually are asymptomatic, but the rest may be symptomatic, and the classical symptoms are strident, hoarse cry or a weak cry, choking on feeds, and recurrent aspiration pneumonia. And associations, tracheoesophageal fistula can be seen in 20 to 27% of these children, whereas 6% of tracheoesophageal fistula will have a tracheoesophageal cleft. And
so the classification is called the Benjamin Inglis classification.
Yes, Benjamin Inglis classification.
Yes. And
I think it was in 1980s they classified. Yeah, go ahead.
And it was modified by Sandow in 2006, sir. And
okay.
Proposed
there are many modifications. Monier's modification also is there.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And there are various proposed models for development of tracheoesophageal cleft, where the most commonly accepted is the embryology and animal model, where the larynx and initially it is a foregut, it develops from the foregut. So there is the separation of foregut, of esophagus and the trachea by formation of the lateral folds. So when these lateral folds, it begins from the caudal direction and then goes up cranially for the development of larynx. So if there is an arrest of development, if there is an arrest of the progression of the cleft or the folds being formed, then it causes LT clefts.
Yeah, that is one theory which is called as the bilateral branchial complexes.
Yes, sir.
They have lateral ridges which arise and fuse and form the common party wall.
Yes, sir.
The other one is the respiratory diverticulum. It arises as a stalk of the ventral aspect of the foregut. Okay.
Yes.
That is another very, very well accepted theory. Respiratory diverticulum arises as a stalk from the ventral aspect of the foregut. It elongates And the ventral foregut mesenchyme, that is the anterior mesenchyme of the foregut, which develops into the tracheoesophageal septum. So it separates the trachea and the esophagus.
Sir,
That is another well accepted theory.
so this theory is called, sir? So,
Respiratory diverticulum.
yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah. Then there are, at the cellular level, there are various theories called as the intraembryonic pressure theory, where they say it is the cervical spine, the curvature, and the arc which causes problem.
Yes.
Then there is a epithelial occlusion theory, where there is recanalization problem. Then there is a vascular theory, like you have in atresia in intestine. Then there is a differential cell growth theory, which is just a modification of the epithelial occlusion theory,
Yes,
where
sir.
the septum fails to develop due to the abnormal cellular differentiation in that region.
Yes. One more, this thing is
Okay.
among the type 1, the submucosal cleft is one important thing, which is also associated with the stenosis of larynx. So they might have stridor and all that. So that's also important. And the aim of treatment involves three things, sir. One is to maintain satisfactory ventilation, and then prevent secondary aspiration, and also to maintain adequate feeding for the child. So these are the aims.
That's correct. So, and reflux also will be very common in them, GE reflux. So many of them will require fundoplication, and some of them will require a gastrostomy or a jejunostomy also.
Yes.
That is important to remember. And important to remember that the outcomes are not great in lesser, the classification, lesser grades of the LTE cleft. The outcomes may be as good as, 5 to 10% mortality, whereas in the higher grade, that is grade 3 and grade 4, it may go up to 50%.
Yes.
And initially for grade 4, it was as much as 95% mortality.
Earlier, the
Now
oral.
it has come down to, now it is still for grade 4, it is hovering around 40 to 50%.
Yes.
It's a highly risky operation to undertake, and most of the children develop problems intraoperatively or die immediately post-operatively for type 4.
Yes.
And many of them, they have found that the cause for mortality is not the LTE cleft per se, but it is the combination of LTE cleft with a serious associated congenital anomaly, like a heart problem.
In case of type 1 clefts, if you are managing conservatively, we would suggest parents to give hard feeds, sir, thick feeds.
Yes, correct. Thickened feeds, yes. And endoscopic treatment also is there, whereby endoscopic treatment in the sense you just inject bulking agent into the area of the interarytenoid folds. You inject bulking agent.
Yes.
Endoscopic.
That is also done.
In type 1 and type 2, where CO2 or CO2 laser is used for looking at legends and closure in 2 layers. Sir.
Yes, correct.
Type 3
and nowadays, people are trying robotic surgery also for this.
Type 3 and type 4 is open approach. Type 3 and 4 is transtracheal through the
No, many advanced airway centers are able to do
type 3.
The majority of type 3 endoscopically now.
They say the sutures, the knots that they put should be towards towards
pharynx,
esophageal side. So if once the suture heals and if suture falls, it should not fall into the trachea.
Yes, correct. So, always the knots will be on the side of the pharynx of the esophagus.
Yes,
correct.
Rest of this type 4 and type 5 will require an ECMO or a cardiopulmonary bypass for the surgery during the surgery.
Correct. Exactly. Yes.
Infusion grafts can be used.
And there are many innovative surgical techniques which have developed. Like some group has developed a special endotracheal tube which has got biflange. It goes and sticks in the carina, and 2 flanges are pushed by the operative surgeon or the ENT surgeon with the bronchoscopy into the 2 main bronchi. Or they do mainstem bronchus intubation and then go ahead with the surgery. So it is a lot of innovations have come out in this surgical treatment.
Yes.
There are interposition grafts in between the 2 layers. Either we can membrane or pericardium or periosteum.
Periosteum is usually used, and very often, since you are in the region of the sternum, the sternal periosteum is used, or the perichondrium is used. Some people also mentioned tibial periosteum for this because you can get lots of periosteum from the tibia, even in a small baby. That's why it is used as a barrier layer.
Sir, 5 minutes off.
Yeah. And also important to remember that the upper part of the repair, especially in a long LTE cleft, you must include what is called as an expansion plasty for the cricoid area. So costal cartilage graft is the commonest way by which to expand the posterior part of the cricoid in this.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
It's a very, very wide topic and very interesting. Since we don't do it very often, we will not be able to, actually visualize how surgery is being done.
Yes.
Beautiful, innovative surgical techniques have been described for this. Okay, next one you wanted is PMDS, no?
Yes, sir.
Okay, shall we go ahead with PMDS?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So PMDS is the persistent Mullerian duct syndrome. Very interesting abnormality where there is a testicular dysfunction actually. One fraction of the testis is not functioning without atypical genitalia. So it is one of the, probably the only GSD without atypical genitalia. It's very, very characteristic. There are two types, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is where the problem is in the MIS gene, which is coded by the from the short arm of the chromosome 19p13. And the MIS gene secretes the anti-Mullerian hormone. When there is low levels of, it codes for the anti-Mullerian hormone, and low levels lead to persistence of the Mullerian duct. Type 2 is where there is a receptor problem. Receptor is in 12q13. And it is called as it is called as the receptor 2, MIH receptor 2, and that causes the lack of response and again persistence of the Mullerian system. These are all phenotypic males who have unilateral or bilateral UDT. They have bilateral fallopian tubes. They have a complete uterus. They have an upper vagina which is draining into the prostatic utricle. It is commonly diagnosed by Mullerian tissue being encountered at herniatomy or orchidopexy. There are three categories which I have described. These three categories have been mainly categorized into female and male. The female presentation is most common, 60 to 70%. I'm talking about the internal arrangement of tissues. 60 to 70% where there is bilateral UDT, which are intra-abdominal, which are positioned similar to the ovary, which mimic the position of the ovary. The second type, which is 20 to 30, is one testis in the hernia sac or scrotum, and contralateral inguinal hernia, which causes hernia uteri inguinalis. The last one, 10%, both testes located in the same sac or in the scrotum very rarely, but in the same hernia sac. That is called as transverse testicular ectopia, which is along with the fallopian tubes, ovary, and the uterus.
Sir.
Fallopian tubes and uterus, not ovary, sorry. In 30% to 50% of transverse testicular ectopia, PMDS is seen. Okay. So important thing is, remember that when you are doing surgery, you have to remove the Mullerian structure. Otherwise, you can have malignancy later in life. And again, if it is not diagnosed well in time, it can cause testicular malignancy, which is in the form of seminoma usually.
Time up, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, one more surgical point what we have to remember is vast difference rise in close proximity to uterus and vagina. So,
yes.
So in some children, they present as cyclical bleeding. Because of the presence of uterus, they have hematuria. They present as cyclical hematuria.
In PMDS?
Yes, sir. It's there in one of the articles, sir. I'll just share it.
Okay. How do you explain the hormonal basis for that?
They say that
because they have normal testosterone secretion and they don't secrete estrogen and progesterone in cycles. How do they develop bleeding?
But that's what they mentioned, sir. It seems there is some peripheral estrogen which causes the uterine tissue to have a cyclical bleeding.
Yeah, testis may get aromatized.
Yes.
I mean, testosterone may get aromatized
Yes, sir. But
peripherally. Normally, aromatase is seen only in breast tissue.
yes,
It is not seen in uterus, as far as I remember. Anyway, I'll have to go through that article.
yes.
Sir,
I'll share
sir,
that.
hematuria has been mentioned as a symptom, sir, in the textbook also, sir.
Oh,
Hello,
okay,
sir.
okay. So maybe I'm mistaken.
It's due to the upper part of the vagina opening near the verumontanum, sir, at the site of the prostatic utricle. So they may present with hematuria.
Sir, and during
So
surgery,
hematuria may be due to just some sort of
Cyclical.
irritation, or it is due to menstruation actually.
It is due to menstruation, sir.
Okay, okay, right.
sir, and during surgery, especially while removing the persistent Mullerian duct, we generally prefer laparoscopic method, and it is
Yes,
basically because we do this. One is to prevent future malignancy for the testis, but for the persistent Mullerian duct, it is basically the mechanical factor. One is this hematuria is what the one symptom, and one more thing is as part of the orchidopexy, there might be the vas might be very closely attached to the uterus, which might be a hindrance for us to bring it down. So that is why we'll have
correct.
to be carefully separating it, and then
Because in many of them you may have to do a Fowler Stephens also. So important to preserve the vas properly so that the blood supply to the testis is preserved. It's very important.
we might have to split the uterus vertically.
Yes, correctly. Yeah, retain part of it and remove only the mucosa
Yes.
and keep the uterus wall intact. That's what has been found. But you have to disconnect it from the
Yes.
prostatic utricle.
Sir, and fertility issues.
They've also found that in PMDS the vas may be absent in some of them, which is really sad actually, or it may be blind ending, or it may be abnormal vas.
Yes.
So that may be one of the problems.
Yes. Sir.
So
I
prior to the advent of artificial reproduction technology, fertility was very, very rarely reported in PMDS,
Yes.
but it was still reported, and it is said that especially fertility is very reported if the one testis is down in the scrotum. That is how it is reported. Yeah, go ahead.
Apart from seminoma, they have also found out gonadoblastoma and
Yes, correct. Gonadoblastoma and choriocarcinoma also, and Mullerian this thing causing adenocarcinoma.
Yes.
also two.
So, in spite of doing fine molecular studies and trying to find out mutation, they have found that in a large series of more than 150 to 160 patients, they were able to locate the mutation in only 88% of the patients. So they call rest as idiopathic, but they are telling we are still pursuing aggressively the molecular basis for the cause, because they are not accepting 12% as idiopathic.
Yes.
That is what a recent paper has told.
They also don't even have hypospadias. The tip, the meatal opening is at the tip itself.
Yes, yes, because testosterone is normal. Secretion of testosterone and dihydrotestosterone also is normal.
Yes.
Sir, leiomyoma of the uterus has also been reported, sir.
Leiomyoma.
Leiomyoma of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
uterus. And
Okay.
fertility, so when it comes to fertility, the spermatogenesis will not be normal in these children, and it's reported like 11% only like are documented to be fertile. They will have
Correct.
some issues with the spermatogenesis.
Yeah.
And the anatomical variant in which the children present with unilateral undescended testis and the contralateral hernia, they will have normal fertility, near normal fertility. The other variant with the bilateral undescended testis, the cryptorchids, the fertility will be like poor. That's
Yeah.
what mentioned.
Correct.
The
Yeah, yeah.
reason for the testis not being descended or staying in the ovarian position is the ovarian ligament, is what they say. Which
Yeah, broad ligament.
Broad-
Broad ligament. Yeah, broad ligament prevents this thing, because for the that portion of the descent of the testis, it is important that Mullerian inhibiting substance is secreted.
Yes.
So, because of the secretion of the Mullerian inhibiting substance, the testis descends from the high pelvic position towards the inguinal position. That is important.
Yes.
MIS for that. And it also facilitates by, as you said now, by releasing by making the Mullerian tissue disappear. It makes the testis free to come down due to the action of the testosterone later and the genitofemoral nerve and all that.
Yes.
That causes the, this is usually post 10 weeks when the Mullerian inhibiting substance acts and completely causes regression of the Mullerian structures.
Yes. Thank you.
Anything else?
No, sir. No, sir.
So what I did not know earlier was this receptor, which was I thought it is always due to only the absence of
Mullerian.
Mullerian inhibiting substance, or the AMH as it was called. I was not aware of the receptor problem. So everywhere there is a hormone and receptor problem. That's what I realized in many of these conditions.
Yes.
Sir, it's also mentioned that even in the absence of the genetic mutation, either for anti-Mullerian hormone or the receptor, they have documented target organ insensitivity, like even without genetic mutation. So
that's what I was telling.
the organ-
That they are telling that is idiopathic. That one large study, more than 150 to 160 patients, they were able to find out this receptor and this gene, AMH gene problem only
hormone
in
is also normal.
88% they have found.
Oh, yes, sir. Okay.
Yeah. When 12% they said it is idiopathic.
Yes.
So they are telling nowadays with the advent of laparoscopy for orchidopexy, we are diagnosing more and more PMDS. This is supposed to be very, very rare. I think before the advent of laparoscopy, the total number of cases reported in the entire world literature were about 500 to 700, I think, total.
Yes.
Now I think it is in more than 1,000 odd cases are there reported in the world literature, and there are large series also being reported by multi-center studies. They are doing and they are reporting.
Yes.
It's very. Anything else?
No, sir.
Okay.
We'll go for the next one, sir.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Primary peritonitis.
Yes, we'll start.
So, yeah, we'll start. Primary peritonitis was very common when I was in training. So, even in the US, apparently it was very common in the 50s and 60s. And we sort of replicate that 2-3 decades later in India also. So, when I was in training, primary peritonitis, which used to occur in females, very characteristically in the pre-pubertal age group, they used to come with severe pain abdomen and symptoms very similar to an acute abdomen, which suggests perforated appendicitis. But you do a scan, and so many of them will be operated. But since we were aware of this primary peritonitis in children, especially in girls, girl babies, in Vellore when I was in training, if it is a characteristic gestalt of symptomatology and clinical features, like fever, very, very high fever, toxicity, abdominal pain and vomiting, and diffuse tenderness when you are examining these babies with no localized findings at all, we knew that we are dealing with most probably primary peritonitis, and we were trained to do paracentesis and take maybe half a cc of fluid, whatever. You will not get much fluid in this sort of peritonitis. So we would get half a cc of fluid, we'll send it across to the syringe to the microbiology, and we would get paged within 15-20 minutes. In Vellore, it was so efficient, and they would say gram positive cocci in chains. That's it, and the diagnosis is made. Gram positive cocci in chains. Diagnosis is made. We used to just bombard these children with crystalline penicillin, and that is it. They will sit up within 2 or 3 doses and say they want to eat. So this was phenomenal, and I can vouch for the fact that primary peritonitis was one of the wonder diseases I treated when I sort of came into pediatric surgery, and I was fascinated by this problem. That is my personal experience with primary peritonitis. Before the advent of antibiotics in the 40s and 30s, in the American series, they had laparotomies done for this and then diagnosed later, and then no antibiotics were available at that time, and or maybe sulfa was the only thing available, and they used to have 50% mortality in the American literature. Now there is absolutely nothing, no mortality at all, and of course the disease itself has disappeared because of treatment of upper respiratory infection with the aggressive treatment of antibiotics, especially by pediatricians. The upper respiratory tract was the source of gram-positive cocci in many of these, but in the girl babies, it was always the vagina which was postulated to be the source of gram-positive cocci.
Sir,
Nowadays, we see more of nephrotic syndrome, hepatic insufficiency, and VP shunt and peritoneal dialysis, coming with features of primary peritonitis. Go ahead.
Primary peritonitis is known to be about 2% of all abdominal emergencies. Though,
This is second years. Okay.
yes, sir, yes.
I can hear the classy presentation of Vidya. Vidya, no?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
yes.
Vidya. You can recognize Vidya anytime. She's like almost like a, like Simi Garewal and all, no, who presents voiceover for documentaries and TV shows and all that. Phenomenal voice she has. Go ahead, Vidya.
Thank you, sir. It is defined as peritonitis resulting from an infectious cause, which is involving the peritoneal cavity in the absence of an intra-abdominal source. Also known as spontaneous
Yes.
peritonitis or idiopathic peritonitis earlier, or a spontaneous ascitic fluid infection. So the possible sources
See, in Vishnu Purana and Bhagavata Purana, no, they say origin of the universe is Swayambhu. So it is like this. It is Swayambhu. And there is no cause for Go ahead.
Yes,
Just
sir.
wanted to make that.
Uh,
Go ahead.
Possible sources explained are a lymphatic source or hematogenous spread or ascending vaginal source, as you mentioned, sir. And usually a single organism is detected, like you said, strep pneumonia.
What is the reason you think? It comes from the vagina? We know that there is a direct luminal continuity between the abdominal cavity and the vagina. But what is the reason it happens?
Sir, I'm not.
It happens only in prepubertal girls.
Lack of a cervical mucus plug. Or the
Cervical mucus plug, yeah, probably could be. But more importantly,
cyclical changes in pH.
There is no pH.
yes, exactly. What happens? pH?
Acidic pH is not there by the.
Yeah, correct.
commensals, it promotes the commensals and
So the presence of estrogen causes the pH to change from what pH to what pH at puberty?
puberty, it becomes more
4.5 is the normal acidic pH, sir. But it becomes
Alkaline.
Alkaline. Yes.
So it promotes bacterial growth.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Go ahead, Vidya. Sorry.
reports mention that about 60% were culture negative, but now it is quoted that almost up to 80 to 90% have a single organism on culture, usually streptococcal pneumonia, E. coli, or Klebsiella. And occasionally anaerobes may be seen like gonorrhea, chlamydia, trachomatis when it is the genital route. And Mycobacterium tuberculosis and Coccidioides immitis have also been isolated as a part of primary peritonitis. And the most common age group is 4 to 9 years, commonly with female preponderance. And so diagnosis is mainly by
This you are talking about primary peritonitis due to streptococcal etiology. That's
Yes.
what you are talking about.
yes.
Yeah. Now we get more of this thing now as a reference from medical side.
Yes, sir.
The other ones. Go ahead. Yeah.
Some of the other associated diseases mentioned, other than nephrotic syndrome and liver disease or cirrhosis, include hyaline membrane
Yes.
disease, cystic fibrosis, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency have also been reported. And
Okay.
other than clinical findings of abdominal pain, fever, and diarrhea, they also have abdominal tenderness. They may or may not have guarding. And peritoneal fluid analysis shows a high absolute neutrophil count, more than 500 per millimeter
Yes.
cube, typically. And with
Correct.
50s,
Correct. Exactly.
pH will be less than 7.35 with an increased raised lactate. Then
Raised lactate. Yes. Yes.
we have to proceed to rule out other causes of acute abdomen, usually acute appendicitis with or without perforation and a perforated ulcer. This is common. And we proceed
Yes.
with imaging. Imaging is usually not contributory. Appendix may be visualized to be normal in these children. So the main modality of treatment is antibiotic, broad spectrum treatment. Currently recommended is a third generation cephalosporin. Most of them
Yes.
respond to this. There's a very good response. And peritoneal lavage is recommended to reduce the bacterial load, usually done by laparoscopic approach as it is safer with fewer complication. And during this appendectomy,
In the institute,
yes,
which group of patients do you see more commonly with spontaneous bacterial peritonitis?
Nephrotic syndrome.
SBP more commonly in the institute, in Indira Gandhi Institute.
Nephrotic syndromes.
Nephrotic syndrome, exactly. So nephrotic, this has been the experience all over the world, and wherever you practice, whether institutional or private practice, nephrotic syndrome is the commonest cause for spontaneous bacterial peritonitis. In fact, they say about 10 to 15% of nephrotic patients, sometime during their disease, will develop spontaneous bacterial peritonitis.
yes, sir. And
And one of the findings they have found on a large series study is that 80% of the nephrotics who develop SBP,
yes,
they
sir.
are either on steroids or they are relapsed nephrotic syndrome
Sir.
patients.
Yes, sir.
So that means the disease severity is very high in them. So that means they will have low serum protein, low opsonin activity. So all those things contribute to
Immunodeficiency.
multifactorial contribution to the spontaneous peritonitis.
Yes, sir.
Sorry.
Yes.
And does Pneumovax work in nephrotic syndrome patients? They give Pneumovax, no, generally.
Yes, sir.
Cellmates.
So mostly no.
Does it work?
No, sir. Mostly.
Yeah, it does work. I have seen it. It does work. It reduces the incidence of SBP significantly. There are studies to prove that.
Yes, sir.
Pneumovax. So all nephrotic syndrome patients get Pneumovax.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Anything else you want to tell about nephrotic?
What about this thing, nephrotic, sir? To continue with the management, sir. Other than laparoscopic peritoneal lavage, during this procedure, appendectomy is controversial. Some of them recommend a routine appendectomy even if it is normal. Whereas there's another group which supports preserving the appendix if it appears normal.
This is when
Generally, in nephrotics, you try to avoid appendicectomy when you're doing laparoscopic lavage. You try to avoid. That has been my personal experience.
Yes.
Because nephrotics are usually very, very fragile patients. So I don't want to do unnecessary, additional surgery, burden them with that. And especially if they're on steroids and all that, no,
Yes.
it is not a very good situation, not a happy situation.
Yes, sir.
Whereas peritoneal dialysis patients and more than peritoneal dialysis, VP shunt patients, I have seen maybe you can go ahead and do an appendicectomy. I don't think it does any problem because anyway you would have externalized the shunt. So you do appendicectomy, clean up everything, come out, and then you can put the VP shunt back in later again.
Yes, sir. And the other thing is placement of a drain. That is again optional. There are no differences quoted between drain placement or without drain. No changes in outcomes. And complications following this is usually subhepatic abscess, pelvic abscess, or wound abscess may develop. Again, the incidence has reduced now. Prolonged ileus may be there. And post-op, there are also reported pneumonia and pleural effusion occurring.
Correct. What about PD? peritoneal dialysis?
So,
It is reported, no, in peritoneal dialysis patients also.
yes.
Okay. Anybody can contribute about peritoneal dialysis?
But this one peritonitis due to peritoneal dialysis, is it primary peritonitis, sir? Or is it?
Primary peritonitis is reported in peritoneal dialysis also.
Yes.
So important thing is to remember that you can have primary peritonitis and you diagnose it by the type of the dialysate which comes out. Then you do the culture of the dialysate. And you have to give IV plus intraperitoneal antibiotics for them. And the peritoneal catheter must be removed when you have either Candida, which is grown, Pseudomonas, which is grown, or atypical mycobacteria. These three organisms, if they are gone, the PD catheter must be removed. Otherwise, you can manage with IV antibiotics and intraperitoneal antibiotics.
Yes.
Important thing to remember is that the insertion of PD catheter, you have to use the what is called as the two cuff catheter. So one cuff is just above the fascia, other one is in the tunnel between the skin and the entry point. Okay.
Yes.
Have you inserted PD catheters?
Yes, sir.
You normally do it? Yeah. Important thing to remember, you use the two cuff system, no, in institute?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Like
Okay.
for most commonly, it is done by the pediatrician on bedside, sir. They just do.
No. That is a different PD catheter. I'm talking about ambulatory CAPD catheter.
Yes,
Then
sir.
it comes to
Continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis catheter.
Yes,
That
sir.
catheter I'm talking about. And that PD where you get primary peritonitis, I'm talking about.
Yes.
So important prevention point is a two cuff system you have to have.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And Candida, Pseudomonas, atypical mycobacteria. These are the things which are indication for removal of the PD catheter, treat the problem, get rid of it, and reinsert the PD catheter.
yes.
Yes, sir.
Hepatic dysfunction, anybody can talk about?
Hepatic dysfunction also is associated with primary peritonitis, especially earlier reports. In earlier reports, mortality was mainly related to the underlying liver disease.
Yes, correct. And one of the pathophysiology is the portal vein flow is shunted away from the liver.
Yes, sir.
And so the liver protective effect of the liver causing elimination of bacteria is gone. So they are more prone for primary peritonitis.
Yes, sir.
Usually associated with gut origin prion. So they are mainly gram-negative organisms. Liver dysfunction associated primary peritonitis.
Yes, sir.
Then there is VP shunt. We already spoke about it. And sometimes you can get sterile peritonitis also
Yes, sir.
without any organism growing, in the sense that truly sterile.
Yes.
So where do you get that?
That can be even in tuberculosis or fastidious organisms which are not grown on regular culture, like even chlamydia.
No. These are immune
SLE
mediated.
or familial Mediterranean fevers.
SLE or familiar Mediterranean fever. Yeah. Right. Anything else? I think we have discussed extensively on primary peritonitis also.
Yes.
Anything? Vinay, Inupriya, Vandana? Achyut doesn't talk at all. Silent he has become. Is he there in the group?
Yes, sir. I'm here on this.
Okay. Please talk, Achyut.
Okay, sir.
And you guys, please inform Dr. Ashita, no? She is very keen. She used to attend now. Today she has not attended. Please inform her about the topics also. She can take part.
Yes, sir. Sure, sir.
And Sheshadri and all, you guys also can take part in the discussion whenever you want. Dr. Sheshadri? Hello?
Hello. Okay, sir. We'll also take
Okay.
part.
Okay.
Okay,
You're
sir.
speaking from your helmet or you're in the hospital?
Sir?
You're driving and speaking from your helmet or from the car, or you're actually in the hospital or at home?
Sir, I'm near the hospital, sir. More or less.
Okay. Okay.
Okay,
So
sir.
you're talking from the helmet or the car? One of the two things.
Yes, sir.
Okay. See, you can diagnose everything.
Yes, sir.
So okay. So be careful, all of you.
Yes, sir.
Double masking, N95, visor, avoid crowding. Remember all those things. They're all good points and they're important points.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
All of you are vaccinated now. Double all the 2 doses.
Yes, sir. Yes.